They sent her to be sacrificed. She returned riding the monster asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mining colony of Kepler 442b as 20-year-old. Zoe Mitchell stood before the Council of Elders. Her hands trembled slightly, but her green eyes blazed with defiance. The metal chains around her wrists felt heavier than the mining equipment she had operated for the past 3 years. Elder Corvanes, a tall reptilian creature with scales that shifted from deep purple to black, towered over the human settlement's governing body. His 3 eyes focused on Zoe with cold calculation. The Vorthic Empire had ruled this sector for centuries, and their demands were absolute. The tribute must be paid, Corvanes hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the fear in the air. Your species has failed to meet the mining quotas. For the 3rd consecutive cycle, the great devourer grows hungry, and only fresh blood will satisfy its appetite. Colony Administrator Brooks, a weathered man in his 60s, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. His weathered face showed the strain of years spent trying to protect his people while appeasing their alien overlords. Elder Corvanes, surely. We can negotiate. Zoe is one of our most skilled miners. Her loss would severely impact our productivity. The alien's laugh was like grinding metal. Productivity is irrelevant when the great devourer feeds. This human female has been chosen. She will be transported to the Crimson Wastes at dawn tomorrow. Zoe's younger brother Jake pushed through the crowd, his 17-year-old face twisted with anguish. Take me instead. I'm stronger. I can fight better than she can. The selection has been made, Corvanes replied without emotion. The great devourer prefers the taste of those who show courage in the face of death. This one's defiance makes her particularly suitable. As the sun began to set, Zoe sat in her small quarters, surrounded by the few possessions she had managed to accumulate during her years on the colony. A photo of her parents, who had died in a mining accident 5 years ago, sat on her makeshift desk. Her father's old toolkit lay open beside it, filled with the instruments that had taught her everything she knew about machines and their inner workings. Jake entered without knocking, his eyes red from crying. There has to be something we can do. The other colonies, the resistance groups we've heard about? There's no time, Zoe said quietly, picking up one of her father's specialized tools. But maybe there's another way. The Vorthic aren't the only ones with secrets on this planet. She pulled out a small device she had been working on in secret, a scanner that could detect energy signatures below the planet's surface. For months, she had been picking up strange readings from the Crimson Wastes, anomalies that the Vorthic seemed to avoid discussing. What is that? Jake asked, leaning closer. Something that might give us hope, Zoe replied, her fingers dancing across the device's controls. The Vorthic call it the Great Devourer, but I think it's something else entirely. These readings suggest it's not just a predator. It's been sending out some kind of signal. The scanner's display showed a complex pattern of energy pulses, rhythmic and almost musical in their structure. Zoe had seen similar patterns before, in the communication arrays her father had worked on. You think it's trying to communicate? Jake whispered. I think it's been trying to communicate for a long time, and the Vorthic have been feeding it people to keep it distracted. Zoe's voice grew stronger as her theory took shape. What if the Great Devourer isn't their weapon? What if it's their prisoner? Outside, the alien guards began their patrol, their heavy footsteps echoing through the colony's metal corridors. Tomorrow would bring the transport to the Crimson Wastes, where countless humans had been sacrificed over the years. But tonight, Zoe Mitchell was forming a plan that would change everything. She looked at her brother one last time, memorizing his face. If I don't come back, tell everyone that the Vorthic aren't as powerful as they pretend to be. Tell them that sometimes the monster they fear most is actually their greatest ally. The transport ship's engines hummed ominously as it descended toward the Crimson Wastes. Zoe pressed her face against the small porthole, watching the landscape change from the familiar browns and greens of the colony to the blood-red desert that stretched endlessly below. The Vorthic pilot, a creature called Nexus, occasionally glanced back at her with what might have been pity. "You are different from the others," Nexus said, his voice a low rumble. "Most humans weep or beg by now. You simply observe. Crying won't change anything," Zoe replied, her scanner hidden in her boot. "I'd rather spend my time understanding what I'm facing." The ship landed with a jarring thud near a massive crater that stretched for miles in every direction. The walls were lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with an inner light, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made Zoe's teeth ache. Nexus led her to the crater's edge, where a narrow path had been carved into the rock. "The great devourer waits below. You will descend alone, as is tradition. If you are fortunate, death will come quickly." But as Zoe began her descent, she noticed something that made her heart race. The crystalline formations weren't random. They formed patterns, circuits almost, like the inside of a massive computer. Her father's training kicked in, and she began to recognize the structure of what appeared to be a communication array built into the crater walls. The path wound downward for what felt like hours. As she descended, the air grew thicker and more, charged with energy. Strange sounds echoed from the depths, not the roars of a monster, but something that sounded almost like music, like whale songs translated into frequencies that human ears could barely perceive. Finally, she reached the bottom of the crater. What she saw there made her gasp in wonder and terror. The great devourer was indeed massive, easily the size of a small building. But it wasn't the savage beast she had expected. Its body was covered in the same crystalline formations that lined the crater walls, and its multiple eyes glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. It was beautiful in a way that defied description, like a living constellation that had taken physical form. More importantly, it was clearly in pain. Thick metal cables connected to various points on its body, and Zoe could see that these weren't feeding tubes. They were restraints, keeping the creature locked in place. The Vorthic hadn't been feeding it. They had been using it as a power source. The creature turned its massive head toward her, and Zoe felt a presence touch her mind. Not invasive or frightening, but gentle, almost desperate. Images flashed through her consciousness, star systems she had never seen, beings of light and energy, and always, always the desire to return home. "You're not from here," she whispered, pulling out her scanner. "You're not even from this galaxy." The creature's response was a wave of confirmation mixed with profound sadness. Through the mental connection, Zoe understood that it had been captured centuries ago, brought here by the Vorthic to power their expanding empire. Every sacrifice had been another attempt to find someone who could communicate with it, but fear had always won out. "They've been looking for someone who could talk to you," Zoe said, stepping closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. But everyone was too scared to try. She approached one of the restraining cables, examining its structure with her father's tools. The metal was alien, but the principles were familiar. Every machine had a weakness. Every system had a way to be bypassed. "I can't promise I can free you," she said, her hands already working on the cable's locking mechanism. "But I can promise I'll try. And if I can't, at least you won't die alone." The creature's gratitude washed over her like warm sunlight. For the first time in centuries, it had found someone who saw it not as a monster, but as a fellow being in need of help. The connection between them grew stronger, and Zoe began to understand that she wasn't just freeing a prisoner. She was awakening something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. As the first restraining cable fell away, the creature's crystalline body began to glow brighter, and the walls of the crater responded with pulses of light that seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. The moment the first restraining cable fell away, everything changed. The creature's body erupted in cascades of light that made the crater walls sing with harmonic frequencies. Zoe felt the being's joy rush through her mind like a flood of warm starlight. But along with the joy came something else. Knowledge dot through their mental connection. She learned that the creature's name was Luminara, and it belonged to a species called the etheric wanderers. They were beings of pure energy who had evolved beyond the need for physical form, choosing instead to explore the universe in crystalline vessels that could travel between dimensions. The Vorthic have been draining your energy for centuries, Zoe said, working on the second cable. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence as she began to understand the alien technology. They've built their entire empire on stolen power. Luminara's response carried images of the Vorthic's first encounter with its people. The empire had been small then, barely controlling a single star system. But when they captured several etheric wanderers, everything changed. The unlimited energy had allowed them to build massive fleets, terraform worlds, and subjugate species across the galaxy dot as the second cable fell away. Zoe felt her own consciousness expanding. Luminara was sharing its knowledge with her, teaching her to see energy patterns that had been invisible before. The crater walls weren't just crystalline formations. They were part of a vast network that connected to other imprisoned etheric wanderers across the galaxy. There are others, she breathed, understanding flooding through her. The Vorthic have been doing this everywhere. The third cable proved more difficult. As Zoe worked, she could hear sounds from above, the roar of engines, the harsh voices of Vorthic guards. They had detected the energy surge and were coming to investigate. "We need to hurry," she muttered, her tools sparking as she fought with the alien nettle. "Once they get down here, we're both dead." But Luminara had other plans. As the sounds of descent grew closer, the creature began to glow even brighter. Energy arced from its body to the crater walls, and suddenly the entire structure began to transform. The crystalline formations rearranged themselves, creating barriers and defensive positions. When the first Vorthic soldiers reached the crater floor, they found themselves facing not a helpless human and a restrained creature, but something that defied their understanding. Zoe stood beside Luminara, her body outlined in the same energy that flowed through the etheric wanderer. The creature's knowledge had shown her how to channel the power, how to become a conduit for forces that could reshape matter itself. "Impossible," hissed Commander Vex, the lead Vorthic warrior. "Humans cannot bond with etheric beings. The energy would destroy your primitive nervous system." "Maybe we're not as primitive as you think," Zoe replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "Maybe you just never gave us the chance to show you what we can do." She gestured, and the crystalline walls responded, sending spears of hardened energy toward the Vorthic forces. The soldiers scattered, their weapons useless against defenses that could adapt and reform instantly. As the battle raged, Zoe continued working on the remaining cables. Each one that fell away made Luminara stronger, and through their bond, made her stronger too. She began to understand that this was what the Vorthic had truly feared. Not just the power of the etheric wanderers, but the possibility that other species might learn to work with them. The fourth cable snapped, and suddenly Zoe could feel the presence of other etheric wanderers across the galaxy. They were awakening, their own bonds with various species beginning to form. The network that had been used to drain their power was becoming a communication system, carrying messages of hope and rebellion to every corner of the empire. "The humans have always been special," Luminara communicated, its thoughts carrying warmth and something that might have been amusement. "Your species has a unique capacity for empathy, for seeing beyond surface appearances. That's why the Vorthic worked so hard to portray you as primitive. They feared what would happen if you ever met us as equals." As the final cable fell away, Luminara rose from the crater floor for the first time in centuries. Its crystalline body expanded, no longer constrained by the Vorthic restraints. Energy flowed freely through its form, and the crater walls began to sing with frequencies that reached out to the stars. Zoe stood beside the magnificent being, her human form still outlined in ethereal light. She was no longer the scared young woman who had been brought here as a sacrifice. She was something new, something that the galaxy had never seen before. A bridge between two species, a translator between different forms of consciousness. Now, what? She asked, watching as more Vorthic reinforcements arrived at the crater's edge. Now, Luminara replied, we show them what happens when the monsters they created decide to fight back. The transformation of the Crimson Wastes could be seen from orbit. What had once been a desolate crater now pulsed with rings of energy that expanded outward like ripples in a cosmic pond. Each pulse carried a message to every corner of the galaxy. The etheric wanderers were free, and they were not alone. Zoe rode atop Luminara as the creature rose from the crater, its crystalline body now fully restored to its magnificent form. The being moved with a grace that defied physics, flowing through the air as if it were swimming through starlight. Below them, the Vorthic forces scrambled to regroup, their weapons and vehicles seeming primitive and clumsy compared to the elegant power of the etheric wanderer. Through their mental bond, Zoe could feel the awakening of other imprisoned beings across the galaxy. On the industrial world of Kef Prime, a factory worker named David Chun had just made contact with another etheric wanderer. On the agricultural colonies of the Zeta Sector, a young teacher called Rosa Martinez was learning to channel the same energies that now flowed through Zoe's consciousness. The network is rebuilding itself, Luminara explained, its thoughts carrying images of the galactic communication system that had once connected all etheric wanderers. For centuries, the Vorthic have used our people as isolated power sources. But now we remember what we were meant to be. A massive Vorthic warship descended from the upper atmosphere, its hull bristling with enough weapons to level a small city. Admiral Korthik himself stood on the bridge, his four eyes fixed on the impossible sight below. The human who should have been devoured hours ago was now riding the creature that had powered his empire for generations. Target the human, he commanded. Kill her, and the bond will be broken. But as the warship's guns opened fire, something extraordinary happened. The energy beams that should have vaporized Zoe instead spread across Luminara's crystalline surface like water, absorbed and redirected harmlessly into the ground. The etheric wanderer's body had become a perfect defense, and through their connection, Zoe had become untouchable. You don't understand what you're facing, she called out, her voice somehow carrying across the vast distance to the warship. This isn't just about one creature or one human. This is about every species you've enslaved, every world you've conquered, every life you've destroyed in the name of your empire. As if summoned by her words, the horizon began to fill with ships, not Vorthic vessels, but the patched together craft of a dozen different species, humans, Salkari, Morphids, Kantari, and others who had suffered under the Empire's rule. They had felt the pulse of awakening energy and had come to witness the moment when everything would change. Leading the rebel fleet was Captain Torres, a grizzled human veteran who had been fighting the Vorthic for 20 years. His ship, the Defiant Spirit, was a patchwork of salvaged parts and stubborn determination. Through his communication array, he broadcast to every vessel in the growing fleet. "This is our moment," he said, his voice carrying across multiple species and languages. "The power source that made the Vorthic invincible is no longer theirs. The playing field has been leveled." But Admiral Korthik wasn't ready to surrender his advantage. He activated a device that every species in the galaxy had learned to fear, a quantum disruptor that could tear apart the fabric of space itself. The weapon had been used to destroy entire star systems, that dared to rebel against the Empire. "If we cannot have the etheric being," he snarled, "then no one can." Charging quantum disruptor. Target: the planet's core. The weapon powered up with a sound like reality tearing. Energy levels that could crack a world began to build in the warship's main cannon. But as the disruptor reached critical charge, something unexpected happened. Luminara's body began to resonate at a frequency that matched the weapon's energy signature. Through their bond, Zoe understood what the etheric wanderer was planning. Not just to absorb the disruptor's power, but to redirect it back at the source. "The weapon that destroys worlds," Luminara communicated, "was built using our people's energy. It's time to show them what happens when that energy chooses its own target." As the quantum disruptor fired, Luminara spread its crystalline form wide, creating a lattice of energy that caught the destructive beam like a spider's web catches light. The power that should have shattered the planet instead flowed through the etheric wanderer's body, amplified by forces that the Vorthic had never understood. The redirected beam struck Admiral Korthic's warship with the force of a collapsing star. The vessel that had terrorized star systems for decades was consumed in a flash of light that could be seen from several star systems away. The destruction was so complete that it left only a brief afterimage against the sky dot in the stunned silence that followed. Zoe's voice rang out across the battlefield. "The age of the Vorthic Empire is over, but the age of cooperation between all species is just beginning." Across the galaxy, other battles were already being fought and won as newly awakened etheric wanderers joined with humans and other species to overthrow their oppressors. The network of communication that had once drained their power was now becoming a network of liberation. 6 months after the Battle of the Crimson Wastes, the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Vorthic Empire, built on centuries of stolen power and oppression, had crumbled like a house of cards. But from its ashes rose something entirely new, a confederation of species working together, guided by the wisdom of the etheric wanderers and the innovative spirit of humanity. Zoe stood on the observation deck of the New Horizon, the flagship of the Galactic Liberation Fleet. The ship itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, etheric energy channeled through human innovation, built with materials provided by the Zelkari mining guilds and navigated using the stellar knowledge of the ancient Morphid star readers. Through the viewport, she could see the construction of Unity Station, a massive space habitat that would serve as the new center of galactic governance. Unlike the towering monuments to power that the Vorthic had built, Unity Station was designed to be a living space where representatives from every species could meet as equals. "The Vorthic survivors are requesting another meeting," reported Commander Rivera, a young human officer who had risen through the ranks during the liberation campaigns. "They say they have information about other imprisoned etheric wanderers in the Outer Rim territories." Zoe nodded, her consciousness still partially merged with Luminara's. The connection between them had grown stronger over the months, allowing her to serve as a translator not just between human and etheric thoughts, but between the various species that made up their new alliance. "Tell them we'll listen," she said, "but any cooperation will depend on their willingness to make amends for the centuries of suffering they've caused." Through the bond, she felt Luminara's approval. The etheric wanderer had been patient and forgiving, but it had not forgotten the pain of captivity. Justice would be served, but it would be justice tempered by the hope of redemption. A chime indicated an incoming transmission from Earth. Zoe's brother Jake appeared on the screen, his face beaming with pride. Behind him, she could see the familiar structures of their old mining colony, but they had been transformed. The ugly industrial buildings had been replaced with elegant structures that incorporated etheric energy principles, creating a harmony between technology and nature. "The terraforming project is ahead of schedule," Jake reported. The etheric wanderers have been teaching us how to heal the environmental damage the Vorthic mining operations caused. The planet is actually becoming more beautiful than it was before colonization. Similar reports were coming in from across the galaxy. Worlds that had been strip-mined and polluted were being restored. Species that had been driven to near extinction were being given new hope. The technology that had once been used for oppression was being redirected toward healing and growth. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the humans themselves. The bond between Zoe and Luminara had been just the beginning. Across human space, individuals were forming connections with etheric wanderers, creating a new form of consciousness. That was neither purely human nor purely etheric, but something greater than either could be alone. Dr. Patricia Wells, the colony's former medical officer, had become the first human to successfully merge temporarily with an etheric wanderer, allowing her to heal injuries that would have been fatal before. Engineer Marcus Cole had learned to channel etheric energy through mechanical systems, creating ships that could travel between dimensions. Artist Luna Chun had discovered that she could paint with pure light, creating works of art that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Vorthic were right about one thing, Zoe mused, watching a group of human children play with young etheric wanderers in the station's garden section. Humans are different, but not in the way they thought. How so? Asked Rivera. They thought we were weak because we formed emotional connections easily. They saw our empathy as a flaw, our willingness to trust as naive. But those are exactly the qualities that made us perfect partners for the etheric wanderers. Luminara's thoughts carried agreement tinged with amusement. Your species has a gift for seeing the potential in others, the being communicated. Even in us, when we had been reduced to mere power sources, you saw living beings deserving of freedom. That vision is reshaping the galaxy. As if to emphasize the point, a report came in from the Andromeda expedition. Captain Sarah Kim, one of the first human etheric bonded pairs, had made contact with an entirely new galaxy. The beings that were unlike anything encountered before, living mathematical equations that existed in pure thought. But already, the expedition was working on ways to communicate, to understand, to build bridges between forms of consciousness that had never met. The universe is so much bigger than we imagined, Zoe said, watching the stars wheel past the viewport. And so much more interconnected. The Vorthic tried to rule through fear and separation, but the real power comes from connection, from understanding, from the willingness to see others as equals. She felt Luminara's presence strengthen in her mind, sharing visions of the future. They were building together. A galaxy where no species stood alone, where knowledge flowed freely between minds, where the diversity of consciousness was celebrated rather than feared. What's our next mission? Rivera asked. Zoe smiled, feeling the pulse of the network that now connected thousands of worlds. We keep growing, we keep learning, and we keep proving that the greatest strength isn't in the power to destroy, but in the courage to connect. As the new horizon turned toward the outer rim, where new worlds and new possibilities awaited, Zoe knew that the girl who had been sent to be sacrificed was truly gone. In her place stood something new, a bridge between species, a translator between forms of consciousness, and a guardian of the future they were all building together. The monster she had been meant to feed had become her greatest ally, and together they were showing the galaxy what was possible when fear was replaced by understanding, when oppression was replaced by cooperation, and when the courage to connect proved stronger than the power to destroy.